Welcome to Marple Parlor, where Miss Marple elegantly solves timeless mysteries.
In the shadowed halls of Witchwood Manor, a scream pierces the night, and a man lies dead, stabbed with a silver letter opener. Who among the elegant guests harbors a deadly secret? Was it the charming war hero, hiding a past too dark to reveal? The nervous cousin, clutching a burned note that whispers of betrayal? Or the poised heiress, whose trembling hands betray a hidden truth? As Miss Jane Marple and Hercule Poirot unravel a web of lies, every glance, every word, every smudged ink stain points to a shocking truth. In this classic Agatha Christie-style mystery, no one is what they seem, and the killer's fatal flaw is just one clue away. Will you guess the murderer before the final reveal? Chapter 1. The Gathering at Witchwood Manor. In the quiet village of St. Mary's Hollow, nestled in the soft folds of the English countryside, Witchwood Manor stood as a monument to a bygone era. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows spoke of old wealth, tempered by time and the gentle decay of neglect. The manor belonged to the Ashburn family, whose name was synonymous with both prestige and whispered scandal. On a crisp October evening in 1925, the manor's great hall was alive with the clinking of crystal glasses and the murmur of polite conversation as the Ashburns hosted a weekend gathering for a select group of guests. The occasion was the engagement of Miss Eleanor Ashbourne, the only daughter of Sir Reginald Ashbourne, a retired barrister whose stern demeanor belied a life softened by privilege. Eleanor, a strikingly beautiful woman of 26, with auburn hair and eyes that held a curious mix of defiance and vulnerability, was to marry Captain Lionel Drake, a dashing war hero whose charm was as polished as his military medals. The engagement had been the talk of St. Mary's Hollow for weeks, not least because of the whispers that Captain Drake's fortunes were less robust than his reputation. The guests were a carefully curated assembly, each chosen for reasons that went beyond mere social courtesy. There was Lady Beatrice Langley, Sir Reginald's widowed sister-in-law, whose sharp tongue and sharper wit made her a formidable presence. Her son, Roger Langley, a lanky young man with a penchant for gambling, hovered near the fireplace, his eyes darting nervously. Dr. Maurice Whitby, the family physician, was a quiet, observant man whose spectacles seemed to magnify his curiosity about those around him. Beside him stood Mrs. Clara Henshaw, a distant cousin of the Ashburns, whose nervous laughter and fluttering hands betrayed a deeper unease. Finally, there was Mr. Victor Crane, a solicitor from London, whose arrival had been met with raised eyebrows, for he was known to handle the Ashbourns' more delicate financial affairs. The great hall was aglow with candlelight, casting shadows that danced across the oak-paneled walls. A grand chandelier hung above the long dining table, where a sumptuous meal was light, but beneath the surface there was an undercurrent of tension, as if each guest were guarding a secret they dared not share. Sir Reginald, seated at the head of the table, raised his glass to toast the young couple. "To Eleanor and Lionel," he said, his voice resonant but strained. "May their union bring joy to this house." The guests echoed the toast, but Miss Jane Marple, seated quietly near the end of the table, noticed the slight hesitation in their voices. Miss Marple, an unassuming spinster from St. Mary Mead, had been invited as a courtesy to her late cousin, who had been a close friend of Lady Beatrice. With her white hair neatly pinned and her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap, she appeared to be little more than a benign observer. Yet her sharp eyes missed nothing, and her mind, as ever, was attuned to the subtle dissonances in human behavior. As the meal progressed, Miss Marple noted the way Eleanor's smile faltered when Captain Drake spoke too long with Mrs. Henshaw, or how Roger Langley's fingers tightened around his glass when Mr. Crane mentioned a recent business venture. She observed, too, the way Dr. Whitby's gaze lingered on Sir Reginald, as if assessing more than his host's health. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 9, and the conversation turned to plans for the weekend, a hunt on Saturday, a walk through the manor's gardens on Sunday. But Miss Marple sensed that the true drama would unfold far sooner. It was just after the dessert course, as the guests retired to the drawing room for coffee, that the first hint of trouble emerged. A maid, young and visibly shaken, entered the room and whispered urgently to Sir Reginald. His face paled, and he excused himself with a curt nod. The guests exchanged glances but continued their chatter. Though Miss Marple's knitting paused briefly as she watched Sir Reginald disappear into the hall. Minutes later, a cry rang out from the study, a sharp, anguished sound that silenced the room. The guests rushed toward the source, Miss Marple among them, her calm demeanor belying the quickening of her pulse. In the study, they found Sir Reginald kneeling beside the body of Mr. Victor Crane, the solicitor. A letter opener, its silver handle gleaming in the lamplight, protruded from his chest. Blood pooled on the Persian rug, and the air was thick with the scent of fear. "Good heavens!" gasped Lady Beatrice, clutching her pearls. "He's been murdered!" Captain Drake, ever the man of action, knelt to check for a pulse, but his grim expression confirmed what was already clear. Dr. Whitby pushed forward, his professional instincts overriding his shock, but even he could only shake his head. Roger Langley stood frozen, his face ashen, while Mrs. Henshaw let out a sob and clung to Eleanor, who seemed oddly composed. Miss Marple, single window, its curtains drawn. A desk was cluttered with papers, one of which bore a fresh ink stain. The letter opener, she noted, was part of a set on the desk, its twin still in its place. The clock on the wall read 9:47 p.m., and the fire in the grate was burning low, casting flickering shadows. "Who could have done this?" Captain Drake demanded, rising to his feet. "We were all in the drawing room." "Not all," Miss Marple said, softly, almost to herself. Her eyes flicked to the faces around her, each one a mask of shock, fear, or calculation. She knew, as surely as she knew the rhythm of her knitting, that the truth lay in the details. The glance, the gesture, the word unspoken. As the guests stood frozen, Sir Reginald rose, his voice trembling. "We must call the police, and we must send for someone who can make sense of this madness." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. She had no need to announce her presence. The truth, she knew, would reveal itself in time, guided by her quiet observation and her little gray cells. Chapter 2. The Shadow of Death. The air in Witchwood Manor seemed to thicken with dread as the reality of Mr. Victor Crane's murder settled over the gathered guests. The study, now a scene of grim finality, was sealed off at Sir Reginald's insistence, though not before the more curious among them had taken a second glance at the body. The letter opener, its blade buried in the solicitor's chest, gleamed accusingly under the lamplight, and the blood on the rug had begun to darken, a stark reminder of the violence that had shattered the evening's civility. Miss Jane Marple, standing just outside the study door, observed the group with her characteristic calm. Her knitting lay folded in her hands, but her eyes were as sharp as ever, darting from face to face. The guests had retreated to the drawing room, where a heavy silence hung, broken only by the occasional crackle of the fire and Mrs. Clara Henshaw's stifled sobs. Sir Reginald, his face ashen, stood by the window, staring out into the darkened gardens as if seeking answers in the shadows. Captain Lionel Drake paced near the fireplace, his military bearings strained by the weight of the moment. Eleanor Ashbourne sat composed, her hands folded in her lap, though Miss Marple noted the faint tremor in her fingers. Lady Beatrice Langley, ever imperious, had taken charge of ordering tea, as if routine could restore order to chaos. Roger Langley, her son, slouched in an armchair, his eyes fixed on the carpet, while Dr. Maurice Whitby hovered near the door. His spectacles glinted. A certain detective, known for his brilliance in unraveling such mysteries. Miss Marple, however, needed no such summons. She had already begun her quiet investigation, her mind sifting through the fragments of the evening like a seamstress sorting threads. "Such a dreadful thing," Mrs. Henshaw murmured, dabbing her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "Who could have done this to poor Mr. Crane? He was only here to discuss business, wasn't he?" "Business, yes," Lady Beatrice said sharply, her voice cutting through the room. But Victor Crane was never one to leave a room without stirring trouble, always poking into matters that didn't concern him. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting, her expression mild. "It is curious, is it not," she said, almost to herself, "that a man of Mr. Crane's profession should meet such a violent end. Solicitors, I find, are often privy to secrets that others would rather keep hidden." Her words hung in the air, and several pairs of eyes flicked toward her, some with curiosity, others with unease. Captain Drake stopped pacing and turned to her. "Are you suggesting, Miss Marple, that Crane knew something dangerous? Something worth killing for?" "I suggest nothing, Captain," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle but her eyes keen. "I merely observe that a man's profession often shapes his fate. And Mr. Crane, I understand, was handling matters for the Ashbourne family. Matters of delicacy, perhaps?" Sir Reginald turned from the window, his face tightening. "Crane was here to finalize some documents related to Eleanor's dowry," he said curtly. "Nothing more. There's no need to spin tales of intrigue." "Of course, Sir Reginald," Miss Marple said, her smile serene. "But it is remarkable how even the simplest matters can grow complicated when emotions are involved." Before anyone could respond, the butler, Mr. Grayson, entered the room, his usual composure strained. "Sir Reginald," he said, bowing slightly, "the police have telephoned. They will arrive by midnight, but they advise that no one leave the manor until they've conducted their inquiries." "Leave?" Lady Beatrice scoffed. "As if any of us would flee into the night like common criminals." "Quite so," Miss Marple murmured, her needles pausing. "And yet it is interesting to consider where everyone was at the time of the crime. The study is not far from this room, and the cry we heard came at precisely 9:47 p.m., did it not?" Her question, posed so innocently, sent a ripple of tension through the group. Roger Langley shifted uncomfortably, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "To the study earlier to fetch some papers. And I stepped out briefly to check on a patient's prescription," Dr. Whitby added, his tone measured. "I was in the library, just down the hall." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged. "And you, Captain Drake? I recall you were speaking with Mrs. Henshaw about the gardens. Did you remain here the entire time?" Drake's jaw tightened, but he answered smoothly. "I may have stepped into the hall for a moment to light my pipe. The drawing room was rather warm." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as silk. "And Mrs. Henshaw, you were so kind as to offer me a biscuit from the tray. I believe you were standing by the table?" Mrs. Henshaw flushed, her hands fluttering. Yes, I think so. Oh, it's all so confusing. I can't think straight with poor Mr. Crane lying dead." There, Clara," Lady Beatrice said, patting her cousin's arm with a touch of impatience. "We must keep our wits about us. The police will sort this out." Miss Marple said nothing, but her mind was already at work, piecing together the fragments of the evening. The study was only a short walk from the drawing room, accessible through a side passage that branched off the main hall. The letter opener, she recalled, had been plunged with force, suggesting either anger or desperation. And then there was the ink stain on the desk, fresh and smudged, as if someone had written or handled a paper in haste. As the guests continued their uneasy conversation, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the alibis. Each one was plausible, yet each had a gap, a moment unaccounted for, a glance that lingered too long. She recalled the way Roger Langley's eyes had darted toward the study door when the cry was heard, and how Eleanor's composure seemed almost too perfect, as if she were holding something back. Dr. Whitby's quiet observation of the group, too, struck her as more than mere curiosity. And Captain Drake's charm, so effortlessly deployed, could easily mask a darker intent. The clock struck 10, and the fire in the grate began to die down, casting long shadows across the room. Miss Marple's knitting resumed its steady rhythm, but her mind was far from idle. She thought of her old friend, Mrs. Bantry, who had once remarked that a village is a microcosm of the world, its secrets hidden in plain sight. Witchwood Manor, she sensed, was no different. The truth lay not in grand gestures, but in the small, overlooked details, the turn of a phrase, the placement of a hand, the shadow that moved where none should be. As the guests awaited the police, Miss Marple knew that the real work of unraveling the mystery had already begun. She would listen, she would watch, and she would let her little gray cells guide her to the truth, no matter how deeply it was buried. Chapter 3. The Arrival of Inquiry. Stark contrast to the unease that gripped the gathered guests. The fire had been stoked anew, casting a warm glow over the faces of those who waited, each lost in their own thoughts. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly in her corner, her knitting needles moving with a gentle precision that belied the sharpness of her mind. The murder of Mr. Victor Crane had cast a pall over the manor, and the anticipation of the police's arrival only heightened the tension. Yet Miss Marple, with her unassuming presence, was already piecing together the fragments of the evening, her observations as delicate and deliberate as the stitches in her work. At precisely 11:52 p.m., the sound of gravel crunching under tires announced the arrival of the authorities. The local police, led by Inspector Harrow, a stout man with a bristling mustache and a no-nonsense demeanor, entered the drawing room with an air of brisk efficiency. Behind him came a younger constable, notebook in hand, and, to the surprise of the guests, a familiar figure. Captain Arthur Hastings, a friend and occasional companion of the renowned detective Hercule Poirot. Hastings, with his earnest face and military bearing, had been staying in a nearby village and had been summoned by Inspector Harrow, who valued his experience in matters of crime. "Good evening," Inspector Harrow said, his voice cutting through the room's heavy silence. "A grave matter has brought us here, and I'll thank you all to cooperate fully. Mr. Crane's death is no accident, and we'll need statements from everyone present." Sir Reginald, still pale but composed, stepped forward. "Of course, Inspector. We're all shaken, but we'll do whatever is necessary. This is a terrible tragedy." "Tragedy or not," Harrow replied, "it's murder, and we'll get to the bottom of it. Captain Hastings, perhaps you'd care to assist?" Hastings nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "I'll do what I can, Inspector. But I must say, this is a shocking business. I've sent word to a friend who may be of greater help, Hercule Poirot. He's in London, but can be here by morning." At the mention of Poirot's name, a murmur rippled through the group. Lady Beatrice raised an eyebrow, her expression a mix of skepticism and curiosity. The Belgian detective? I've heard of him. A bit theatrical, isn't he? Theatrical, perhaps, Hastings said with a small smile, but uncommonly effective. Poirot has a way of seeing what others miss. Miss Marple's lips twitched faintly, though she said nothing. She had heard of Poirot, of course, and admired his reputation for logic and precision. Yet she also knew that her own method, study, ensuring the scene remained undisturbed, and began questioning the guests. Let's start with the timeline, he said, flipping open his notebook. When was Mr. Crane last seen alive, and where was each of you at 9:47 p.m. when the cry was heard? Sir Reginald spoke first, his voice steady but strained. I was called away by the maid, Sarah, at around 9:30. She said there was an issue with the wine cellar. I was in the hall when I heard the cry and rushed to the study, where I found poor Crane. And you, Miss Ashbourne? Harrow turned to Eleanor, who sat with her hands clasped tightly. I was in the drawing room with the others, Eleanor said, her voice clear. I'd been speaking with Mrs. Henshaw about the wedding plans. I didn't leave until we all heard the cry. Mrs. Henshaw nodded vigorously, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. That's right, Inspector. Eleanor and I were together. I was pouring coffee when it happened. Captain Drake, standing by the fireplace, cleared his throat. I was in the drawing room as well, though I stepped into the hall briefly to light my pipe. I couldn't have been gone more than a minute or two. Convenient, Roger Langley muttered, earning a sharp glance from his mother. He shrugged, his tone defensive. I was here the whole time, Inspector. Ask anyone. I was sitting by the window, reading a newspaper. Dr. Whitby adjusted his spectacles. I was in the library, as I mentioned earlier. I'd gone to fetch a medical journal I'd left there. I heard the cry and returned immediately. Lady Beatrice, her posture regal, fixed Harrow with a steely gaze. I was in this very room, Inspector, supervising the serving of coffee. I assure you, I saw nothing untoward until we all rushed to the study. Miss Marple, who had been silent, spoke softly. And I, Inspector, was here as well, knitting by the fire. I recall the clock striking 9:45 just before the cry, which places the time quite precisely. Harrow scribbled in his notebook, his brow furrowed. Right, so most of you were in the drawing room, except Sir Reginald in the hall, Dr. Whitby in the library, and Captain Drake in the hall for a moment. And Mr. Crane? When did he leave the drawing room? He excused himself just after dessert, Eleanor said. He said he needed to fetch some papers from the study for Father. That was around 9:20, I believe. Harrow nodded, his eyes narrowing. So, between 9:20 and 9:47, someone entered the study and stabbed Mr. Crane with the letter opener. The weapon was part of a set on the desk, correct? Yes, Sir Precision. Quite right, Miss Marple, she supplied, her smile serene. Just a guest, Inspector, but I do notice things. Hastings, who had been listening intently, gave her an appraising look. Miss Marple, you say? I've a feeling you and Poirot would get on splendidly. The questioning continued, but Miss Marple's mind was already turning over the details. The side passage, she knew, was narrow and dimly lit, used primarily by the servants. It offered a discreet route to the study, one that someone could have taken without being noticed. She recalled, too, the ink stain on the desk, a fresh smudge, as if a paper had been moved or written on in haste. And then there was the letter opener's twin, still in its place, suggesting the murder was not premeditated, but a crime of opportunity. As Harrow concluded his initial inquiries, he turned to the group. "No one is to leave the manor until we've searched the premises and taken full statements. Constable, ensure the study remains secure. Captain Hastings, I'd appreciate your assistance in the morning when your friend arrives." "Of course," Hastings said, though his eyes lingered on Miss Marple, as if sensing her quiet authority. As the guests dispersed to their rooms, Miss Marple remained in the drawing room, her knitting resumed. She thought of her village, St. Mary Mead, where secrets were often hidden in plain sight, much like the ones she sensed here. The cry at 9:47, the ink stain, the side passage, all were threads in a tapestry she was beginning to weave. And somewhere, she knew, was a fatal flaw, a single glance or gesture that would unravel the truth. The questions begin. The clock in Witchwood Manor's drawing room struck midnight, its somber chimes echoing through the tense silence that had settled over the guests. The murder of Mr. Victor Crane had transformed the manor's elegance into a stage for suspicion, and the arrival of Inspector Harrow and Captain Hastings had only deepened the unease. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting, observed the group with her usual quiet precision, her sharp eyes catching every fleeting glance and nervous gesture. Hercule Poirot, who had arrived just before midnight after a swift journey from London, stood by the mantelpiece, his small, meticulous figure radiating calm authority. His presence, like a finely tuned instrument, promised to unravel the mystery, and he wasted no time in beginning his inquiries. Poirot's green eyes scanned the room, taking in the assembled guests: Sir Reginald Ashbourne, Eleanor, Captain Lionel Drake, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger, Dr. Maurice Whitby, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw. Each face, he noted, was a mask, concealing secrets beneath a veneer of shock or sorrow. Inspector Harrow, his notebook open, stood ready to record, while Hastings, ever loyal, watched Poirot with a mix of admiration and anticipation. "And precise. A crime has been committed, a most brutal crime. Monsieur Victor Crane, he is dead, stabbed in the heart with a letter opener. Hercule Poirot, he does not believe in coincidence. Every detail, every word, every glance, it matters, and so we begin with the questions." He turned to Sir Reginald, whose stern demeanor had softened into a pallor of grief. "Sir Reginald, you were the first to find the body, oui? Tell me, what did you see when you entered the study at 9:47 p.m.? Sir Reginald cleared his throat, his hands clasped tightly. "I was in the hall speaking with the maid Sarah about a minor issue with the wine cellar. I heard a cry, a sharp, terrible sound, and rushed to the study. There was Victor, lying on the rug, the letter opener in his chest, blood everywhere. I checked for a pulse, but he was gone." Poirot nodded, his mustache twitching slightly. "And the room? It was undisturbed? No papers out of place, no signs of struggle?" Sir Reginald hesitated, his eyes flicking to the floor. "The desk was a bit messy, papers scattered, an inkwell tipped over, but I didn't touch anything. I called for the others immediately." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mind noting the hesitation in Sir Reginald's voice. The inkwell, she thought, was a detail worth remembering. A tipped inkwell suggested haste or a struggle, and the smudged ink stain she had observed earlier might hold a clue. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a spilled teacup had revealed a liar's haste. Here, the ink might tell a similar story. Poirot turned to Eleanor, whose composure was a stark contrast to her father's agitation. "Mademoiselle Ashbourne, you were in the drawing room, oui? With whom, and what did you see or hear?" Eleanor's voice was steady, her hands folded in her lap. "I was with Mrs. Henshaw discussing wedding plans. We were by the coffee tray when the cry came. I didn't see anything until we all rushed to the study." Mrs. Henshaw nodded vigorously, her handkerchief fluttering. "Yes, that's right. Eleanor and I were together. I was about to pour coffee when we heard it, a dreadful sound. Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. And you, Madame Henshaw, you did not leave the drawing room at any time? No, I was here, Mrs. Henshaw said, her voice rising. I mean, I might have stepped to the table for sugar, but I was here with everyone. Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Henshaw's trembling hands. The coffee tray, she recalled, had been untouched when the cry was heard, its cups still stacked neatly. Mrs. Henshaw's claim of pouring coffee was a small inconsistency, but in a village like St. Mary Mead, such slips often led to larger truth. Drake's jaw tightened, but he answered smoothly. It was just before the cry, say 9:45. I was only gone a moment. The drawing room was stuffy and I needed air. And you saw no one in the hall? Poirot pressed, his tone deceptively mild. No one, Drake said firmly. Just the usual shadows. I lit my pipe and came back. Poirot nodded, then turned to Roger Langley, who slouched in an armchair, his eyes darting nervously. Monsieur Roger, you were reading a newspaper, oui? By the window, alone? Roger swallowed, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Yes, I was right there. Didn't move until we heard the cry. Everyone can confirm it. Lady Beatrice, her voice sharp, interjected. My son was exactly where he says, Mr. Poirot. I was watching the room, ensuring the coffee was served properly. Bien, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. And Dr. Whitby, you were in the library fetching a journal. You heard the cry from there. Dr. Whitby adjusted his spectacles, his voice calm but measured. Yes, I was in the library, just down the hall. I heard the cry and came at once. I saw nothing unusual until I reached the study. Miss Marple's mind was racing, piecing together the alibis. The side passage to the study, accessible from both the drawing room and the library, was a critical detail. It was narrow, dimly lit, and used primarily by servants, making it a perfect route for someone to slip away unnoticed. She noted, too, the way Roger's eyes avoided his mother's, and how Drake's hand twitched when questioned about the hall. Small details, but in her experience, they were the threads that unraveled a mystery. Poirot stepped to the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. Each of you have given your account, and yet there is a puzzle. The study, it is not far, 10 seconds through the side passage, 15 from the hall. The letter opener, it was taken from the desk, a weapon of opportunity. And the ink stain, as Mademoiselle Marple so astutely observed, it was fresh, smudged, as if a paper was moved in haste. What was Monsieur Crane writing or reading before he died? The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. She thought of the draft of the will, mentioned by Harrow, and the financial matters Crane had been handling. Eleanor's dowry, Roger's debts. The ink stain suggested a document, perhaps a note or a letter, that someone had wanted to conceal. In St. Mary Mead, a misplaced letter had once revealed a thief. Here, the stain might point to a murderer. Poirot's voice softened, but his eyes were sharp. The questions, they are only the beginning. Hercule Poirot, he listens, he observes, and he will find the truth in the details. The glance, the gesture of their shared purpose. The questions had begun, and with them, the unraveling of Witchwood Manor's secrets. Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Witchwood Manor, casting a pale light over the drawing room where the guests had reconvened. The air was thick with unease, the events of the previous night hanging over them like a storm cloud. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles clicking softly, her eyes moving from one face to another with the quiet intensity of a hawk. Hercule Poirot's arrival had brought a new energy to the manor, but it had also sharpened the suspicions that simmered among the group. The police, led by Inspector Harrow, were now focused on an obvious suspect, and the red herrings, as Miss Marple had anticipated, were beginning to surface. Inspector Harrow stood at the center of the room, his notebook open, his mustache bristling with determination. "We've made progress," he announced, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "The evidence points strongly to one individual, and I intend to question him further. Mr. Roger Langley, step forward." Roger, slouched in an armchair, started as if struck. His face, already pale, drained of what little color remained. "Me?" he stammered, rising unsteadily. "What evidence? I was in the drawing room all evening." Harrow's eyes narrowed. "Not according to the maid, Sarah. She saw you in the hall near the study at 9:40 p.m., just minutes before the cry was heard. And we found a handkerchief in the study, monogrammed with your initials, R.L. Care to explain?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Roger. Lady Beatrice, his mother, stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "This is preposterous," she said sharply. "My son is no murderer. That handkerchief could belong to anyone." "Not quite, Lady Beatrice," Harrow countered. "The monogram is distinctive, and Sarah's testimony places Mr. Langley near the scene. Furthermore, we've learned that Mr. Crane was handling a financial matter involving your son, a gambling debt, I believe, that threatened to ruin him." Roger's hands clenched into fists, his voice rising. "Yes, I owed money, but I didn't kill him. Crane was helping me settle it. Why would I murder the man who was saving me?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on Roger's flushed face. She noted the tremor in his voice, the way his eyes darted toward his mother for reassurance. It was a convincing performance, but she had seen such displays before. Fear could mask guilt, or it could simply be fear. She glanced at Poirot, who stood by the fireplace, his hands clasped behind his back, his mustache impeccably groomed despite the early hour. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, missed nothing. "Inspector," Poirot said, his voice smooth and precise, "the hands are not conclusive. A handkerchief may be dropped or planted. And the hall is a thoroughfare, n'est-ce pas? Many could have passed through it." Harrow frowned, clearly unaccustomed to being questioned. "Perhaps, Mr. Poirot, but motive is key. Mr. Langley had reason to fear Crane's influence. A man in debt is a desperate man." "Desperation," Poirot mused, "is a common affliction, Inspector. But let us consider the facts. The letter opener was taken from the desk, yes? A weapon of opportunity, not premeditation. And the ink stain, fresh, as Miss Marple so astutely observed, suggests a paper was handled in haste. What was Mr. Crane writing or reading before he died?" Miss Marple's lips curved slightly at Poirot's mention of her observation. She had shared her thoughts with him earlier that morning, over a cup of tea, and found his mind as sharp as her own. "Indeed," she said softly, drawing the room's attention. "The ink stain is curious. It was smudged as if someone had brushed against it, and the papers on the desk, did they not include a draft of a new will, Inspector?" Harrow hesitated, then nodded. "We found a draft, yes. It was incomplete, but it suggested changes to Sir Reginald's estate. Mr. Crane was revising it at Sir Reginald's request." A murmur rippled through the room. Eleanor Ashbourne's eyes widened slightly, and Captain Drake's hand tightened on the arm of his chair. Sir Reginald, standing by the window, turned sharply. "That's nonsense," he said. "The will was a minor update, nothing more. Crane was simply tidying up details." "Details," Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild, "can be deadly, Sir Reginald. A will, even an incomplete one, can alter fortunes. And fortunes, they inspire passions." Miss Marple nodded almost imperceptibly. She had noticed the way Sir Reginald's voice caught on the word details, and how Eleanor's gaze flicked toward her father, then away. There was something there, she thought. A secret tied to the will, perhaps, or to the dowry Crane had been finalizing. She recalled, too, the side passage to the study, which Roger could have used, but so could others. The maid's testimony was compelling, but Sarah was young and nervous, easily swayed by suggestion. As Harrow continued to press Roger, who grew increasingly agitated, Miss Marple's mind turned to the other guests. Captain Drake, for all his charm, had been absent from the drawing room for a brief moment, long enough, perhaps, to slip into the study. Dr. Whitby, too, had been in the library, a room adjacent to the study's side passage, and Mrs. Henshaw, whose nervous chatter seemed designed to deflect attention, had been pouring coffee. Speaks, if one knows how to listen. Harrow reluctantly agreed, and the group moved to the study, where the constable stood guard. The room was as it had been the previous night, save for the body, which had been removed to the village morgue. The letter opener's twin gleamed on the desk, and the ink stain remained, a dark smudge against the polished wood. Poirot knelt to examine the desk, his fingers tracing the papers. "This draft," he said, lifting a sheet. "It mentions a change in the beneficiary of a trust. Most curious." Miss Marple, standing near the window, noted the curtains, slightly askew, as if someone had brushed against them. She stepped closer, her eyes catching a faint mark on the sill, a scuff, barely noticeable, as if a shoe had grazed it. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle, "might you examine this window? It seems to have been disturbed." Harrow frowned but complied, finding the latch slightly loose. "It's possible someone entered or exited this way," he admitted. "But the window was closed when we arrived." "Closed? Yes," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "But not locked. A clever misdirection, perhaps, to suggest an outsider. Yet the manor is isolated, and the grounds were empty last night." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Roger seized the moment. "See? It could have been someone from outside. You're wasting time on me." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, though her mind was far from idle. The handkerchief, the maid's testimony, the window, they were all distractions, she sensed, designed to obscure the truth. The real clue lay in the human heart, in the glance that betrayed fear, the word that revealed too much. She thought of her village, where a misplaced letter or a whispered confidence could unravel a scandal. Here, in Witchwood Manor, the stakes were higher, but the principle was the same. As the group returned to the drawing room, Poirot caught Miss Marple's eye, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. The red herrings were plentiful, but the truth, they both knew, was waiting to be uncovered, hidden in the details only their little gray cells could discern. Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Witchwood Manor, but within its walls, the atmosphere remained heavy with suspicion. The guests, confined to the manor by Inspector Harrow's orders, moved on reverence. His small, neat figure moved through the room like a conductor, orchestrating a symphony, noting every detail, the angle of the letter opener's twin, the exact placement of the ink-stained paper, the faint scuff on the windowsill Miss Marple had pointed out. Now, as the clock struck 2, he gathered the guests in the drawing room, his green eyes gleaming with purpose. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, we are faced with a puzzle, and the pieces, they are scattered. But Hercule Poirot, he does not despair, no. He observes, he reflects, and he finds the truth in the smallest of details. Today, we shall discuss a clue, a gesture, a moment that reveals an inconsistency. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Poirot and Inspector Harrow, who stood by the fireplace, his notebook at the ready. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood near Poirot, his expression a mix of curiosity and trust. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly, listened intently, her mind already sifting through the morning's revelations. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us return to the moment of the crime, 9:47 p.m. When the cry was heard, each of you has given an account of your whereabouts, and yet there is a discrepancy, a small thing perhaps, but to Poirot, it is significant. Madame Henshaw, you said you were pouring coffee, oui? Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her hands twisting her handkerchief, nodded vigorously. Yes, Mr. Poirot. I was by the table, serving coffee. I told the inspector so. Précisément, Poirot said, his tone deceptively mild. And yet Miss Marple, with her remarkable attention to detail, noted that the coffee pot was untouched when the cry was heard. The tray, it was undisturbed, the cups still empty. How, then, were you pouring coffee, madam? A gasp escaped Lady Beatrice, and Mrs. Henshaw's face flushed crimson. I must have been mistaken, she stammered. I meant to say I was about to pour coffee. It was all so sudden, you see, with the cry and the rush to the study. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes meeting Poirot's for a fleeting moment. She had indeed noticed the coffee tray, its silver pot gleaming, its cups neatly stacked, untouched by Mrs. Henshaw's trembling hands. It was a small inconsistency, but in her experience, such slips often pointed to larger truths. She recalled a similar incident in St. Mary Mead, where a villager's claim of baking bread had unraveled when the oven was found cold. Here, the coffee pot was her oven, and Mrs. Henshaw's flustered response was a thread to be pulled. Poirot turned to the group, his mustache twitching slightly. This small detail, it raises a question. If Madame Henshaw was not pouring coffee, where was she? The drawing room, it is large, but it is not so large that leads to the study. Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened, and she clutched her handkerchief to her chest.
I didn't! I swear I didn't! I was here with Eleanor, talking about the wedding!
Eleanor Ashbourne, seated beside Captain Drake, nodded, though her expression was guarded. Mrs. Henshaw was with me, she said softly. We were discussing the flowers for the ceremony. And yet, Poirot continued, the side passage, it is most convenient, no? A few steps, and one is in the study, unseen by those in the drawing room. And the letter opener, it was there, waiting on the desk. Inspector Harrow scribbled furiously, his brow furrowed.
Are you suggesting Mrs. Henshaw had something to do with this, Mr. Poirot? She's a nervous sort, but a murderer?
Poirot raised a hand, his expression serene. I suggest nothing, Inspector. I merely point out the inconsistency. And there is another detail, one that Miss Marple, with her admirable perception, brought to my attention. The ink stain on the desk. It was fresh, smudged, as if a paper had been moved in haste. But the draft of the will, it was neatly placed, unblemished. Why then the smudge? Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her voice gentle. It is curious, is it not, that the ink was smudged, but the papers were not. It suggests, perhaps, that something else was written or touched before the murder. A note, perhaps, or a letter that was quickly removed. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Sir Reginald, who had been standing by the window, turned sharply. "A note! There was no note found in the study, Miss Marple. The police searched thoroughly." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "But in my experience, things that are missing are often as telling as things that are found. A note could have been taken or destroyed by someone who wished to conceal its contents." Poirot's eyes gleamed with approval. "Exactement, Mademoiselle Marple. The absence of a thing. It is a clue in itself. And so we must ask, who had reason to conceal a note? Who had reason to fear what Mr. Crane knew?" The guests exchanged uneasy glances, and Miss Marple noted the subtle shifts in their postures. Captain Drake's hand tightening on his chair, Roger Langley's eyes darting toward his mother, Dr. Whitby's spectacles glinting as he adjusted them. Each someone to the study in moments, unseen by the others. She thought too of Mrs. Henshaw's flustered response, and of the way Eleanor's eyes had flickered when the will was mentioned. The draft of the will, Poirot had noted, altered the terms of a trust, one that, rumor had it, involved Eleanor's dowry and Roger's debts. Could the note, if it existed, have been a warning, a threat, or a confession? And who would have had the opportunity to write it, and the motive to destroy it? As the questioning drew to a close, Poirot announced that he would continue his observations, urging the guests to remain vigilant. "The truth," he said, "it is like a delicate embroidery. One must pull the right thread to see the pattern." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. The coffee pot, the ink stain, the side passage, they were threads indeed, and she was determined to follow them to their source, where the fatal flaw in the killer's design lay waiting. Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The atmosphere in Witchwood Manor grew increasingly taut as the afternoon wore on, the weight of Mr. Victor Crane's murder pressing down on the guests like a fog that refused to lift. The drawing room, once a haven of polite conversation, now felt like a stage where each player masked their true intentions. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her knitting, observed the subtle interplay of glances and gestures, her mind as sharp as the needles in her hands. Hercule Poirot, ever the maestro of deduction, had spent the day probing the edges of the mystery, and now, as the clock neared 4, new secrets were beginning to unravel, like threads pulled from a tightly woven tapestry. Poirot had requested a private meeting with the guests, one by one, in the library, a room adjacent to the fateful study, its shelves lined with leather-bound volumes and its air heavy with the scent of old paper. Inspector Harrow, though initially skeptical of Poirot's methods, had agreed to let him take the lead, provided Captain Hastings remained present to take notes. Miss Marple, though not invited to these interviews, had positioned herself strategically in the drawing room, where she could overhear snippets of conversation through the open library door and observe the comings and goings of the guests. The first to be called was Lady Beatrice Langley, whose imperious demeanor seemed unshaken despite the mounting tension. As she emerged from the library, her face was set in a scowl, and she muttered something about impertinent foreigners. Miss Marple noted the way her hands clenched her shawl, a sign of agitation she had not seen before. Next was Roger Langley, who entered the library pale and returned paler still, his eyes avoiding his mother's as he slumped into a chair. Dr. Maurice Whitby followed, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted them nervously, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, who emerged dabbing her eyes, seemed on the verge of collapse. It was during Eleanor Ashburn's interview that Miss Marple's attention sharpened. The young woman, poised and composed, had entered the library with a calm that seemed almost rehearsed. Through the open door, Miss Marple caught fragments of Poirot's questions, gentle but incisive, probing the details of Eleanor's engagement and her father's financial arrangements with Mr. Crane. When Eleanor returned to the drawing room, her face was pale, and her hands, usually so still, trembled slightly as she smoothed her dress. Captain Drake was the last to be questioned, and his interview was the longest. Miss Marple noted the muffled sound of raised voices. Not Poirot's, for his tone remained even, but Drake's, tinged with defensiveness. When he emerged, his jaw was tight, and he avoided Eleanor's gaze, striding to the window to stare out at the gardens. As the guests reassembled, Poirot entered the drawing room, his mustache immaculate, his expression serene. "Mes amis," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "The truth. It begins to emerge, like the sun through the clouds. But there are clouds still. Lies, half-truths, secrets that must be brought to light." Inspector Harrow, standing by the fireplace, crossed his arms. "What have you found, Mr. Poirot? You've been asking questions all day, but we're no closer to an arrest." Poirot raised a finger, his eyes gleaming. "Patience, Inspector. The lies, they are like the layers of an onion. Peel one away, and another is revealed. Let us begin with Monsieur Roger Langley. You told us, did you not, that Mr. Crane was helping you settle a gambling debt?" Roger shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted to his mother. "Yes, that's right. He was negotiating with my creditors. I had no reason to harm him." "And yet," Poirot said, "you failed to mention that Mr. Crane had discovered a discrepancy in your accounts, a sum of money borrowed from the Ashburn estate that you had not repaid, a sum that, if revealed, would have disgraced you." A gasp escaped Lady Beatrice, and Roger's face flushed. "That's not true," he protested. "Crane never said anything about that." "But he did," Poirot countered, producing a folded letter from his pocket. "This was found among Mr. Crane's papers, hidden in a book in the study. It is a note from him to you, dated 2 days ago, warning that he intended to inform Sir Reginald of the missing funds." The room fell silent, and Miss Marple's needles paused. She had suspected a financial motive, but the specificity of Poirot's revelation was telling. The letter, she thought, could explain the ink stain on the desk, a hurried response, perhaps, or a confrontation that had turned deadly. "Were seen by the butler, Mr. Grayson, leaving the side passage to the study at 9:42 p.m. "Why were you there?" Mrs. Henshaw's eyes widened and she let out a sob. I was only looking for a book. I thought I'd left one in the study earlier that day. I didn't see Mr. Crane, I swear." "A book," Poirot mused, his tone skeptical. "Yet you did not mention this before? And the butler? He says you seemed agitated, clutching something in your hand. A letter, perhaps? Or a note you did not wish others to see?" Mrs. Henshaw collapsed into a chair, her sobs growing louder. Miss Marple, watching closely, noted the way Eleanor reached out to comfort her cousin, but her touch was fleeting, almost reluctant. There was a rift there, she sensed, a hidden tension that went beyond the murder. Poirot's gaze shifted to Captain Drake, who stood rigid by the window. "And you, Capitaine, you spoke of lighting your pipe in the hall. Yet the hall was cold and there was no scent of tobacco. Instead, we found a matchstick freshly struck near the study door. Were you perhaps closer to the scene than you admitted?" Drake's eyes flashed with anger. "I lit my pipe and returned immediately. Are you accusing me, Poirot?" "I'm a soldier, not a sneak thief." "Not accusing," Poirot said smoothly, "merely observing. The matchstick. It is a small thing, but it tells a story. And the story? It is not yet complete." Miss Marple's mind was racing, weaving together the new revelations. The letter to Roger, Mrs. Henshaw's presence in the side passage, the matchstick. They were all threads, but they did not yet form a pattern. She thought of her village, where a stolen shilling or a whispered affair could unravel a household. Here, The stakes were higher: money, honor, love, and the lies were piling up, each one obscuring the truth. As Poirot concluded his questioning, he turned to the group, his voice soft but commanding. The lies, they protect the guilty, but they cannot hide forever. Hercule Poirot, he will find the truth, and it will be revealed in the smallest of details. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her eyes fixed on the guests. The letter, the passage, the matchstick, they were clues, yes, but they were also distractions. The real truth, she sensed, lay in the emotions beneath the lies. The fear in Roger's eyes, the tremor in Eleanor's hands, the defiance in Drake's voice. Somewhere, in a glance or a gesture, was the fatal flaw that would unravel the mystery. Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The twilight shadows lengthened across the grounds of Witchwood Manor, mirroring the growing unease within its walls. The guests, bound by the constraints of the ongoing investigation, had grown weary of the suspicion that clung to them like damp mist. The revelations of the afternoon, Roger Langley's hidden debt, Mrs. Henshaw's presence in the side passage, Captain Drake's matchstick had tightened the noose of distrust, and the air in the drawing room was thick with unspoken accusations. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the fire with her knitting, observed the fraying tempers with her usual quiet acuity, her little gray cells sifting through the tangle of lies and half-truths. Hercule Poirot, ever the master of timing, sensed that the moment was ripe for a breakthrough, and his next move would push one of the suspects to the edge. Poirot had requested that the guests gather once more in the library, a room that seemed to hold the echoes of Mr. Victor Crane's final moments. The shelves, lined with dusty tomes, loomed over the group, and the faint scent of ink and leather lingered in the air. Inspector Harrow stood by the door, his mustache twitching with impatience, while Captain Hastings, notebook in hand, watched Poirot with the trust of an old friend. Miss Marple, though not formally part of the inquiry, had been invited by Poirot, who valued her insight. She sat near the window, her needles clicking softly, her presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice a velvet blade. "We have peeled away the layers of deception, but the heart of this mystery remains hidden. The murder of Monsieur Crane was not a random act. It was personal, driven by passion, fear, or greed. And now, one of you holds a truth that cannot be contained. It is time to speak." The guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Poirot and each other. Lady Beatrice Langley, her posture rigid, fixed him with a defiant stare. "This is absurd," she said. "You've hounded my son, accused poor Clara of sneaking about, and now you expect someone to confess? You're grasping at straws, Mr. Poirot." Poirot's mustache twitched, but his expression remained serene. "Not grasping, madame, but observing. And what I observe is a crack in the facade, a moment of weakness that betrays the heart. Let us consider, for example, Mademoiselle Eleanor." Eleanor Ashbourne, seated beside Captain Drake, stiffened, her hands clenching in her lap. "What do you mean, Mr. Poirot?" she asked, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "You have been the picture of composure, mademoiselle, even in the face of tragedy. But there is a detail, a small gesture, that tells a different story. When the draft of the will was mentioned, your hand trembled, ever so slightly. And when I spoke of a missing note, your eyes, they darted to your father. Why, I wonder?" Eleanor's face paled, and Captain Drake leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Leave her alone, Poirot. She's done nothing wrong. She was with Miss—" There and back before the coffee grows cold. Sir Reginald, who had been silent, stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous. My daughter is no murderer. Crane was here to finalize her dowry, nothing more. Poirot raised a hand, his eyes never leaving Eleanor. The dowry, oui? But the draft of the will, it suggested changes, not only to the dowry, but to the trust that governs the Ashbourne estate. A trust, I believe, that affects not only you, Sir Reginald, but also your daughter, and perhaps others in this room. The silence that followed was electric, broken only by a sudden choked sob from Mrs. Clara Henshaw. All eyes turned to her as she rose from her chair, her handkerchief falling to the floor.
I can't bear it anymore,
she cried, her voice trembling.
I didn't kill him, but I know something. I saw something that night, and I've been too afraid to say.
Poirot's eyes gleamed, and Miss Marple's needles paused, her gaze fixed on Mrs. Henshaw's trembling form. Speak, madame, Poirot urged gently. What did you see? Mrs. Henshaw's hands twisted together, her words tumbling out in a rush.
It was just before the cry, at 9:42, when I was in the side passage. I wasn't looking for a book. I lied about that. I was following Mr. Crane. I'd overheard him talking to Sir Reginald earlier about the will, and I was worried. I thought he might be changing something that affected me. My inheritance, you see, is tied to the estate. I saw him in the study, writing something, and then I saw someone else.
The room seemed to hold its breath. Inspector Harrow leaned forward, his pencil poised. Who, Mrs. Henshaw? Who did you see? Mrs. Henshaw's eyes darted to Eleanor, then away. It was dark, and I only saw a shadow, a figure moving toward the study door. I thought it was Captain Drake because of his height, but I couldn't be sure. I turned and ran back to the drawing room before anyone saw me. Captain Drake's face darkened, and he rose to his feet. That's a lie. I was in the hall, lighting my pipe, not skulking in the passage. You're trying to pin this on me to save yourself. Mrs. Henshaw shrank back, tears streaming down her face.
I'm not lying. I swear I saw someone. I didn't want to say anything because I was afraid of what it meant.
Miss Marple watched the scene unfold, her mind racing. Mrs. Henshaw's confession was a turning point, but it was incomplete, a partial truth that raised more questions than it answered. The shadow in the passage could have been Drake, or it could have been someone else, Roger perhaps, or even Dr. Whitby, whose quiet demeanor hid a keen intelligence. She thought of the ink stain, the missing note, the scuffed windowsill, details that pointed to a hurried act, a deeper fear. Poirot, sensing the moment's fragility, stepped closer to Mrs. Henshaw. Madam, you have been brave to speak, but there is more, is there not? The note Mr. Crane was writing, what did it say?
Mrs. Henshaw shook her head, her voice barely a whisper.
I didn't see it clearly. It was just a few words. Something about the trust and betrayal. I ran before I could read more.
Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable.
Merci, madame. Your words, they bring us closer to the truth.
As Mrs. Henshaw sank back into her chair, sobbing softly, Miss Marple's mind turned to the note.
The trust and betrayal. Words that carried weight, hinting at a motive rooted in the Ashbourne family's secrets. She recalled a similar case in St. Mary Mead, where a whispered word in a garden had unraveled a web of deceit. Here the stakes were higher, but the principle was the same. The truth lay in the emotions that could no longer be contained.
The guests dispersed, their nerves frayed, and Poirot exchanged a glance with Miss Marple.
A breakthrough, mademoiselle,
he said softly.
But the puzzle, it is not yet complete.
Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. The shadow in the passage, the note's cryptic words, Eleanor's tremor, they were all pieces of the tapestry, and the fatal flaw, she sensed, was closer than ever to being revealed.
Chapter 9. The Trap. The evening shadows deepened over Witchwood Manor, casting an air of foreboding that matched the mounting tension within its walls. The guests, worn thin by suspicion and the relentless probing of Hercule Poirot, gathered once more in the drawing room at his request. The fire crackled in the grate, its warmth doing little to dispel the chill of distrust that hung over the group. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary corner with her knitting, observed the scene with her quiet, penetrating gaze, her little gray cells humming with the threads of the mystery. Poirot, ever the orchestrator, had decided it was time to set a trap, a psychological gambit designed to force the truth into the open. Inspector Harrow, standing by the fireplace, looked skeptical but intrigued, his notebook tucked under his arm. Captain Hastings, ever loyal, stood near Poirot, his earnest face reflecting a mix of anticipation and trust. The guests, Sir Reginald Ashbourne, Eleanor, Captain Drake, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger, Dr. Maurice Whitby, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, sat in a tense semicircle, their expressions ranging from defiant to fearful. Mrs. Henshaw, still shaken from her earlier confession, clutched her handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Eleanor's composure, though intact, seemed brittle, while Captain Drake's military bearing was marred by a clenched jaw. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, neat figure commanding attention. "Mes amis," he began, his voice smooth and deliberate, "we are close to the truth, but it hides behind a veil of fear and deception. Tonight, Hercule Poirot will lift that veil. I have a theory, a reconstruction of the events that led to Monsieur Crane's death, and I invite you to correct me if I err." The guests exchanged wary glances, and Miss Marple's needles slowed, her attention fixed on Poirot's words. She knew this was no mere recitation. It was a calculated move to provoke a reaction, to flush out the guilty with the pressure of exposure. "Let us return to 9:47 p.m., Poirot continued, pacing slowly. "The cry is heard, and we rush to the study to find Monsieur Crane, stabbed with the letter opener. But the story begins earlier, at 9:20, when Crane excuses himself to fetch papers. He is alone in the study, writing a note, perhaps, or reviewing the draft of the will. Someone enters, unseen, through the side passage. There is an argument, a moment of passion, and the letter opener, so conveniently placed, becomes the weapon." He paused, his green eyes scanning the room. "But who entered? Madame Henshaw, you admitted to being in the passage at 9:42, seeing a shadow. You thought it was Capitaine Drake, but you could not be sure." Monsieur tightened in her lap, but she said nothing. Roger shifted uncomfortably, and Drake's eyes narrowed. Poirot continued, undeterred. "Then there is the ink stain, a fresh smudge, suggesting a paper was moved in haste. And the note Madame Henshaw saw, with its words of trust and betrayal. I propose a theory. The murderer wrote a note to lure Crane to the study. Or perhaps Crane wrote a note that threatened to expose a secret. That note is now missing, but its shadow remains." Miss Marple nodded almost imperceptibly, her mind racing. The note, the passage, the smudge, they were all pieces, but Poirot's trap was in his delivery, his careful phrasing designed to unsettle the guilty. She recalled a case in St. Mary Mead where a villager's confession had come not from evidence, but from the fear of being found out. Here, Poirot was weaving a similar web, and she sensed the moment was near. Poirot turned to Sir Reginald, his tone gentle but probing. "Sir Reginald, the will was to alter the trust, oui? A trust that affects your daughter's dowry, and perhaps others in this room. Did Crane discover something that threatened your plans?" Sir Reginald's face reddened. "I've told you, Poirot. It was a minor update. Crane was loyal to this family. He had no enemies here." "No enemies?" Poirot mused, raising an eyebrow. "Yet someone killed him. And the matchstick, Captain Drake, found near the study door, your matchstick, perhaps, from lighting your pipe? Or was it placed there to mislead? Drake stood, his voice sharp. I've had enough of your insinuations, Poirot. I was in the hall, not the study. If you have proof, show it. Poirot's smile was serene. Proof, Capitaine, is in the details. And so, I propose a test. Let us reenact the moments before the cry. I ask each of you to take your places as they were at 9:45 p.m. Madame Henshaw, by the coffee table. Mademoiselle Eleanor, beside her. Monsieur Roger, by the window. Captain Drake, in the hall. Dr. Whitby, in the library. Sir Reginald, in the hall with the maid. Lady Beatrice, supervising the coffee, and Mademoiselle Marple, knitting by the fire. The guests hesitated, but Poirot's authority was undeniable. Slowly they moved to their positions, the room buzzing with tension. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, watched closely, her eyes catching every movement. Poirot stepped into the hall, then returned, his watch in hand. At 9:40,
Took the note. I saw it on the desk when I was in the study. It said, "The trust is a lie. You betrayed me." I was afraid it pointed to me, so I burned it in the fire.
The room froze, and even Poirot's composure faltered for a moment. Miss Marple's needles stopped, her eyes narrowing. The note's contents, now revealed, were a bombshell, but Mrs. Henshaw's confession was only part of the truth. The words trust and betrayal pointed to a deeper motive, one tied to the Ashbourne family's secrets. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his voice stern. "Mrs. Henshaw, you tampered with evidence. That's a serious offense."
I was scared.
She sobbed.
I thought it would make me look guilty.
Poirot raised a hand, his eyes gleaming. "Merci, madame. Your confession, it is a step toward the truth. But the note, it was not yours to write, nor to destroy. It points to another hand, another heart." Miss Marple's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The note, the passage, the tremor in Eleanor's hands, the anger in Sir Reginald's voice, they were all threads, and the trap had begun to close. She thought of her village, where a single word could unravel a life. Here the note's destruction was a desperate act, but it had revealed a crack in the killer's armor, a crack that Poirot and Marple would exploit. As the guests stood shaken by Mrs. Henshaw's outburst, Poirot's gaze met Miss Marple's, a silent acknowledgment of their shared purpose. The trap had been sprung, and the truth was closer than ever, waiting in the shadows of Witchwood Manor. Chapter 10. The Reveal. The drawing room of Witchwood Manor was steeped in a tense silence, broken only by the faint crackle of the fire and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. The guests, gathered at Hercule Poirot's insistence, sat in a semicircle, their faces a gallery of apprehension, defiance, and fear. Mrs. Clara Henshaw's confession about burning the note had cracked the facade of their collective composure, and now, as the clock struck 8, Poirot stood ready to unveil the truth. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting needles still for the first time that evening, watched with keen eyes, her little gray cells attuned to every nuance of the scene. The moment of the reveal had arrived, and the truth, so carefully hidden, was about to be laid bare. Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, meticulous figure radiating authority. His green eyes gleamed with the certainty of a man who had solved the puzzle, and his mustache twitched with quiet satisfaction. Inspector Harrow stood by the fireplace, his skepticism tempered by curiosity, while Captain Hastings, ever the faithful chronicler, held his notebook ready. The guests, Sir Reginald
Poirot began,
his voice clear and deliberate. "We have journeyed through a labyrinth of lies, but now Hercule Poirot will guide you to the truth. The murder of Monsieur Victor Crane was no random act. It was a crime of passion, born of betrayal and fear. And the key? It lies in the smallest of details, observed by the remarkable Mademoiselle Marple and confirmed by the little grey cells of Poirot." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her expression serene, but her mind alert. She had shared her observations with Poirot earlier that day, and together they had pieced together the mosaic of clues, the ink stain, the side passage, the burned note, the scuffed windowsill, and the tremor in Eleanor's hands. Now, Poirot would weave them into a narrative that would expose the killer. "Let us reconstruct the night of the murder," Poirot continued, pacing slowly. "At 9:20 p.m., Monsieur Crane excuses himself to fetch papers from the study. He is alone, writing a note. The trust is a lie. You betrayed me, as Madame Henshaw saw before she burned it. This note was not a draft of the will, but a personal accusation, written in haste. At 9:42, Madame Henshaw sees a shadow in the side passage, and at 9:47, the cry is heard. Crane is found stabbed with the letter opener, a weapon of opportunity. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. The clues, they are many. The ink stain, fresh and smudged, suggests a paper was moved. The handkerchief, monogrammed with R.L., points to Monsieur Roget. The matchstick near the study door implicates Capitaine Drake, and the windowsill, scuffed as if someone climbed through, suggests an outsider. But these, mes amis, are distractions, red herrings to obscure the truth. Roger Langley shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. "I told you, that handkerchief could have been planted. I was in the drawing room." "Indeed," Poirot said, raising a finger. "And the matchstick, Capitaine Drake, it was not yours, was it? For you do not smoke a pipe. You prefer cigarettes, as I observed in your jacket pocket." Drake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Poirot turned to Mrs. Henshaw. "And you, madam, you burned the note out of fear, but it was not your secret it protected. The note was written by Crane to confront his killer, a killer who betrayed him." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, her thoughts aligning with Poirot's. The note's words, trust and betrayal, pointed to a personal motive, one tied to the Ashbourne family's secrets that Crane discovered. And that betrayal, it points to one person. He turned to Eleanor, whose composure faltered, her hands clenching in her lap. "Mademoiselle Eleanor, you were in the drawing room, oui, but you were not with Madame Henshaw at 9:45. You slipped through the side passage unseen to confront Crane. He had discovered your secret, a secret that threatened your engagement to Capitaine Drake." Eleanor's face drained of color, and a gasp escaped Lady Beatrice. "What secret?" Sir Reginald demanded, stepping forward. "My daughter is innocent." Poirot's eyes never left Eleanor. Crane had learned that you, mademoiselle, had been secretly meeting another man, a former suitor, perhaps, or a lover, whose existence would ruin your reputation and your engagement. The note was Crane's warning to you, written in anger. You went to the study to plead with him, but the argument grew heated. In a moment of desperation, you seized the letter opener and struck. "No!" Eleanor cried, rising to her feet. "I didn't kill him.
I loved Lionel. I would never risk our future.
But Poirot was relentless. The tremor in your hands, mademoiselle, when the will was mentioned. It was not fear of the dowry, but fear that Crane's note would expose your secret. The ink stain. It was from your sleeve, brushing the desk as you took the note. And the scuffed windowsill. It was not an entry, but your attempt to make it appear an outsider had come. A clumsy misdirection. Captain Drake stood, his voice shaking with fury. You're wrong, Poirot. Eleanor was with me. She couldn't have done it. Poirot raised a hand. Capitaine, your loyalty is admirable, but it blinds you. The side passage, it takes only 10 seconds to reach the study. Eleanor was absent for a moment, unnoticed in the chaos of the coffee tray, and Madame Henshaw, in her fear, burned the note to protect her cousin, not knowing it pointed to the killer. Mrs. Henshaw sobbed, her hands covering her face. Miss Marple, watching closely, saw the truth in Eleanor's eyes, a flicker of guilt quickly masked. She thought of her village, where a young woman's secret affair had led to a desperate act, and she knew Poirot's reconstruction was correct. Inspector Harrow stepped forward, his voice stern. Miss Ashbourne, if this is true, you must come with us. Eleanor's composure broke, and she sank into her chair, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to, she whispered. He was going to tell everyone.
Will take its course.
Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her heart heavy, but her mind clear. The fatal flaw, the glance, the tremor, the note had been revealed, and the mystery of Witchwood Manor was solved. Chapter 11. The Reflection. The drawing room of Witchwood Manor, once a stage for polite gatherings, now felt like a somber chapel, its air heavy with the weight of Eleanor Ashbourne's confession. The fire in the grate burned low, casting flickering shadows across the faces of the guests who sat in stunned silence. Eleanor, her composure shattered, had been escorted to her room by Inspector Harrow and the constable, pending formal charges. The remaining guests, Sir Reginald, Captain Drake, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger, Dr. Maurice Whitby, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, remained seated, their expressions a mix of shock, grief, and relief. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting folded neatly in her lap, observed the scene with quiet compassion, her little gray cells reflecting on the tragedy that had unfolded. Hercule Poirot, his task complete, stood by the window, his small figure silhouetted against the twilight, his mind already turning to the deeper lessons of the case. Inspector Harrow, wiping his brow, turned to Poirot. Well, Mr. Poirot, you've done it again. A confession, clear as day. I'll admit, I thought young Langley was our man, but you saw through the fog. And you, Miss Marple, he added, nodding to her, your eye for detail didn't hurt either. Poirot inclined his head, his mustache twitching slightly. Merci, Inspector. But the truth, it is not the work of one mind alone. Mademoiselle Marple, her observations, the ink stain, the windowsill, the tremor in Mademoiselle Eleanor's hands, they were the threads that guided Poirot to the solution. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes soft but keen. You are too kind, Mr. Poirot. I merely noticed what was there to be seen. In my village, St. Mary Mead, one learns that human nature is the same everywhere, whether in a cottage or a manor. A glance, a gesture, a word out of place, they tell the story, if one listens. Captain Hastings, closing his notebook, looked at Poirot with admiration. I say, Poirot. It was a masterstroke, that reenactment. You knew it would push someone to break, didn't you? Poirot's eyes gleamed. The mind, Hastings, it is like a delicate mechanism. Apply the right pressure, and it reveals its secrets. Mademoiselle Eleanor. She was strong, but the weight of her guilt, it was too much. The note, the betrayal, the fear of exposure, they disappointing those they love. Eleanor's secret, her meetings with another man, must have felt like a burden too heavy to share. Mr. Crane's discovery threatened not only her engagement, but her place in your heart. In a moment of panic, she acted, as so many do when they feel cornered. Poirot nodded, his expression somber. The human heart, it is a complex thing, Sir Reginald. It seeks to protect, to love, but it can also destroy. Mademoiselle Eleanor, she loved Capitaine Drake, but she feared the loss of that love. The note, it was Crane's accusation, and in her desperation, she struck. Captain Drake, who had been silent, his head bowed, looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. I should have seen it, he said hoarsely. I knew she was troubled, but I thought it was nerves about the wedding. If I'd asked, if I'd listened. There is no blame in love, Capitaine, Poirot said softly. You could not have known the depths of her fear. The fault lies with the secret and with the man who used it to threaten her. Miss Marple thought of her village, where secrets had unraveled families before. A stolen letter, a whispered rumor, a moment of weakness. She recalled a young girl in St. Mary Mead who had hidden a love affair, fearing her father's wrath, only to be undone by a careless word. Eleanor's story was not so different, and Miss Marple felt a pang of sorrow for the girl whose life had been altered by a single, desperate act. Lady Beatrice, her face pale but composed, spoke sharply. And what of Clara? She burned the note, hid the truth. Is she to face no consequences? Mrs. Henshaw, her sobs quieter now, looked up, her face streaked with tears. I only wanted to protect Eleanor, she whispered. I thought the note would make her look guilty. I didn't know. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat. Mrs. Henshaw, tampering with evidence is serious, but given the circumstances, the law may be lenient. We'll take your statement formally tomorrow. Poirot turned to the group, his voice reflective. This case, it reminds us that truth is not only in the facts, but in the heart. The ink stain, the handkerchief, the matchstick, they were clues, yes, but it was the human soul that revealed the killer. Mademoiselle Marple, she understands this, as do I. We look not only at what is done, but why. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes meeting Poirot's. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen many secrets, Mr. Poirot. They are kept out of love, or fear, or shame, but they always find a way to the surface. Poor Eleanor. Hercule Poirot. He will return to London. But the lesson, it remains. Truth. It is a mirror that reflects us all. Miss Marple rose, her knitting tucked into her bag, her expression serene, but tinged with sadness. And I shall return to St. Mary Mead, she said softly, where the lessons of human nature are never far away. As the guests dispersed, their footsteps echoing in the silent manor, Poirot and Marple exchanged a final glance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared understanding. The mystery was solved, the truth revealed, but the cost, as always, was a heavy one. Chapter 12. The aftermath of truth. The late afternoon light filtered through the heavy curtains of Witchwood Manor, casting a muted glow over the drawing room where the guests had gathered once more. The revelation of Eleanor Ashbourne's guilt in the murder of Mr. Victor Crane had left a profound mark on the household, like a wound that had yet to heal. The air was thick with a mixture of relief and sorrow, as the truth, though uncovered, brought no comfort to those who remained. Miss Jane Marple, seated by the window with her knitting neatly folded in her lap, observed the group with her characteristic, quiet insight, her sharp eyes noting the subtle shifts in their demeanor. Hercule Poirot, his work nearly complete, stood by the fireplace, his meticulous appearance a stark contrast to the emotional disarray around him. The investigation had reached its climax, but the aftermath demanded a final reckoning. Inspector Harrow, his notebook now brimming with the details of Eleanor's confession, and the secondary admissions of Mrs. Clara Henshaw and Dr. Maurice Whitby, stood near the door, his stern expression softened by a hint of weariness. Captain Hastings, ever the loyal companion, sat nearby, his pen poised as he prepared to record Poirot's final thoughts. The guests, Sir Reginald Ashbourne, Captain Lionel Drake, Lady Beatrice Langley, Roger, Dr. Whitby, and Mrs. Henshaw, sat in a loose arrangement, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions, grief, guilt, and a tentative hope for closure. Poirot, his hands clasped behind his back, addressed the group with a calm authority. "Mes amis," he began, his voice steady and precise. "The mystery of Monsieur Crane's death is solved, and the truth, it has been revealed. Mademoiselle Eleanor, she has confessed, and the law will now take its course. But the aftermath of such a truth, it leaves questions, not of guilt, but of the heart. Why did she act? What drove her to such—" Mrs. Henshaw's trembling hands. She recalled a case in her village where a young woman's betrayal had led to a theft, forgiven only through the community's compassion. Eleanor's crime was far graver, but the principle remained. Understanding could pave the way to healing. Sir Reginald, his voice heavy with anguish, spoke first. "Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple, you've given us the truth, but at what cost? My daughter, she's lost to me now. How could I have failed her so?" Poirot's eyes softened, though his posture remained erect. "Sir Reginald, you did not fail her. The heart, it is a fragile thing, and Mademoiselle Eleanor, she carried a secret that weighed heavily. The note, the trust is a lie. You betrayed me. It was Crane's accusation, born of his discovery of her meetings with another man. She feared losing Capitaine Drake, her reputation, her future. In that moment, she chose a path of desperation." Miss Marple's voice was gentle, almost maternal. "In St. Mary Mead, I have seen young women hide their fears, believing they protect those they love. Eleanor's secret was a burden she could not share, and Mr. Crane's threat to expose it pushed her beyond reason. It is a tragedy, Sir Reginald, but not one you could have foreseen." Captain Drake, his face drawn, looked up, his voice raw. "I keep asking myself what I could have done differently. If I'd noticed her distress, if I'd questioned her silences, could I have stopped this?" Poirot shook his head, his tone kind but firm. "Capitaine, you loved her. And love, it blinds us to the shadows. You saw her as she wished to be seen, happy, devoted. But the heart, it hides its pain. and Mademoiselle Eleanor. She hid hers too well. Mrs. Henshaw, her sobs quieter now, spoke through her handkerchief. I burned the note to protect her, but I only made things worse. If I'd told the truth from the start, Miss Marple reached out, her hand resting lightly on Mrs. Henshaw's arm. My dear, you acted out of loyalty, as so many do. In my village, I've seen such acts. Small lies told to shield a loved one, only to complicate the truth. You meant no harm, and your confession helped us see the light. Dr. Whitby, adjusting his spectacles, added quietly, and I, with the windowsill, I thought I was helping Eleanor, but I muddied the waters. I'm sorry for my part in this. Inspector Harrow, his mustache twitching, interjected. You both tampered with evidence, and that's a matter for the courts. Threads of love, trust, and sometimes pain. The threads are frayed, but they can be mended. Time, it heals, and truth, it strengthens. You will find a way, as families do. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where scandals, though smaller in scale, had tested families and friendships. She recalled a young couple who had weathered a betrayal through patience and understanding, emerging stronger for it. Witchwood Manor, she believed, could do the same, though the path would be long. As the conversation drew to a close, Poirot turned to Hastings, a faint smile playing on his lips. Mon ami, you have recorded the facts, but have you learned the lesson? The truth, it is not only in the clues, the ink stain, the note, the windowsill, but in the hearts that hide them. Hastings chuckled, closing his notebook. I've learned, Poirot, that you and Miss Marple see things I never will. This case, it's a reminder that people are more than their actions. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled as she rose, her shawl draped over her shoulders. And in St. Mary Mead, Captain Hastings, I've learned that every action has a story, and every story has a heart. This manor's story is a sad one, but it is not without hope. As the guests began to disperse, their footsteps echoing in the silent hall, Poirot and Marple prepared to take their leave. The aftermath of truth had left its mark, but it had also cleared the way for healing, however slow and painful. The detectives exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey through the shadows of Witchwood Manor. Chapter 13. The Unseen Threads. The morning mist clung to the grounds of Witchwood Manor, softening the edges of the ancient oaks and the stone walls that had borne witness to so much tragedy. Inside, the atmosphere was no less heavy, though the resolution of Mr. Victor Crane's murder had brought a semblance of closure. The guests, still reeling from Eleanor Ashbourne's confession, moved through the manor with a subdued air, their conversations hushed and their glances guarded. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the drawing-room with her knitting, observed the subtle undercurrents of emotion that lingered among them. Hercule Poirot, preparing to depart for London, had agreed to one final gathering to tie up the loose ends of the case, and Miss Marple sensed that there were still threads, unseen but vital, that needed to be addressed. The drawing-room was bathed in the pale light of the overcast sky.
The circle, their expressions a mix of exhaustion and unease. Eleanor, under the constable's watch, was absent, her fate now in the hands of the law. Poirot, his mustache impeccably groomed despite the early hour, stood at the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mes amis," he began, his voice calm but resonant. "The case of Monsieur Crane's murder is solved, and Mademoiselle Eleanor has confessed. Yet there are questions, small threads, as Mademoiselle Marple might say, that remain. Hercule Poirot does not leave a puzzle incomplete, and so we shall weave these threads into the tapestry of truth." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes meeting Poirot's with a quiet understanding. She had spent the previous evening reflecting on the case, her mind returning to the details that had seemed peripheral but now felt significant. The scuffed windowsill, the burned note, the matchstick, and the subtle glances that had passed between the guests. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that even a solved mystery could hide deeper truths, and she sensed that Witchwood Manor held one final secret. Poirot turned to Mrs. Henshaw, whose red-rimmed eyes betrayed her sleepless night. "Madame Henshaw," he said gently, "you burned the note to protect your cousin Eleanor, oui? But there is more to your story, is there not? You knew of her secret, the meetings with another man. Did you not suspect her guilt before you burned the note?" Mrs. Henshaw's hands twisted her handkerchief, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't want to believe it. Eleanor was always so kind to me, like a sister. When I saw the note, I thought it might point to her, and I panicked. I didn't know she'd done it until she confessed." Miss Marple nodded slightly, her thoughts aligning with Poirot's. Mrs. Henshaw's loyalty to Eleanor was genuine, but her actions had obscured a crucial piece of evidence, delaying the truth. She recalled a similar incident in her village, where a well-meaning friend had hidden a letter to protect a loved one, only to complicate a scandal. Here, the burned note had nearly derailed the investigation, but Poirot's persistence and her own observations had prevailed. Poirot's gaze shifted to Captain Drake, whose face was drawn with grief. "Capitaine, you defended Mademoiselle Eleanor fiercely, even when the evidence mounted. Did you know of her secret meetings, or did your love blind you to the truth?" Drake's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his voice low. "I suspected she was hiding something, moments when she seemed distant, letters she'd hide when I entered the room. But I thought it was wedding nerves." The scuffed windowsill. It had been a clever misdirection, designed to suggest an outsider. But Eleanor's confession had confirmed it was her doing. Yet something about the scuff nagged at Miss Marple, a detail that felt out of place. She spoke softly, her voice cutting through the room's tension. "Mr. Poirot, might I ask about the windowsill?" The scuff was fresh, but it was high, as if someone had climbed out, not in. Could it be that another hand was involved? Not in the murder, but in the attempt to mislead? Poirot's eyes gleamed with approval. "An excellent observation, Mademoiselle Marple. The scuff, it was indeed a distraction, but not Eleanor's alone. I believe another among us sought to protect her, to cast doubt on the scene." He turned to Dr. Whitby, whose spectacles glinted as he adjusted them nervously. "Doctor, you were in the library at 9:45, oui? A room adjacent to the study, with access to the side passage. You have been quiet, observant, but I have noticed your glances toward Mademoiselle Eleanor, toward the study door.
Did you, perhaps, see more than you have said? Dr. Whitby's face paled, and he hesitated before speaking. I saw Eleanor enter the passage just before the cry. I suspected she was meeting someone, but I didn't follow. Later, when I heard the cry and rushed to the study, I saw the body and I scuffed the windowsill. I thought it might confuse things, give her a chance. A murmur rippled through the room, and Lady Beatrice's eyes narrowed. You tampered with the scene, Doctor, to protect a murderer? I didn't know she was the murderer, Whitby protested, his voice rising. I thought she might be in trouble, and I acted on impulse. I've always cared for Eleanor as a friend of the family. I couldn't bear to see her accused. Miss Marple's lips curved faintly. Dr. Whitby's confession explained the windowsill, a detail that had puzzled her. It was a small act of loyalty, misguided but human, and it reminded her of a St. Mary Mead villager who had hidden a neighbor's stolen goods out of misplaced kindness. Here, Whitby's actions had complicated the investigation, but they also revealed the depth of emotion that had driven the tragedy. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. The group, his voice reflective. The truth, it is a mirror that shows us our flaws. In this manner, love and loyalty led to deception, but also to revelation. Hercule Poirot, he sees the human heart, and he understands its complexities. Miss Marple, rising to gather her things, added softly, And in St. Mary Mead, I have seen that even the kindest hearts can err. We are all human, Sir Reginald, and we all carry our burdens. As the guests dispersed, their footsteps heavy with the weight of the truth, Poirot and Marple exchanged a final glance, a silent acknowledgement of their shared journey through the maze of Witchwood Manor's secrets. Chapter 14. The Quiet Departure. The morning at Witchwood Manor dawned with a stillness that seemed to mourn the events of the past days. The mist had lifted, revealing the rolling hills of St. Mary's Hollow in crisp clarity, but within the manor's walls, the weight of tragedy lingered. Eleanor Ashbourne's confession had unraveled the mystery of Mr. Victor Crane's murder, and the subsequent revelations of Mrs. Henshaw and Dr. Whitby's actions had laid bare the complexities of loyalty and deception. Miss Jane Marple, preparing to return to St. Mary Mead, sat in the drawing room, her knitting packed away, her sharp eyes taking in the final moments of the drama. Hercule Poirot, his suitcase neatly packed, stood ready to depart for London, his task complete, but his mind still reflecting on the case's intricacies. The guests had gathered one last time, their faces etched with the strain of the investigation. Sir Reginald Ashbourne, his shoulders stooped with grief, stood by the window, staring out at the gardens where his daughter's future had once seemed so bright. Captain Lionel Drake, his military bearing softened by sorrow, sat alone, his eyes fixed on a photograph of Eleanor he held in his hand. Lady Beatrice Langley, her imperious demeanor subdued, spoke in low tones to her son, Roger, whose nervous energy had given way to a quiet resignation. Dr. Maurice Whitby adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of regret, while Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her handkerchief crumpled, dabbed at her eyes. Inspector Harrow and Captain Hastings were present, the former preparing to escort Eleanor to the police station, the latter ready to accompany Poirot back to London. Poirot, his moustache as impeccable as ever, addressed the group with a calm authority. Mes amis, he said,
his voice carrying a note of finality. The tragedy of Witchwood Manor is resolved, but its lessons remain. The murder of Monsieur Crane was not merely a crime of violence, but a crime of the heart, a betrayal born of fear and love. Hercule Poirot has uncovered the truth, but it is a truth that brings Clara's loyalty, Dr. Whitby's misguided act. They are all part of the human tapestry, woven with threads of frailty. Sir Reginald turned from the window, his voice hoarse. What will become of my daughter, Mr. Poirot? She's confessed, but she's so young, so lost. Inspector Harrow cleared his throat, his tone professional but not unkind. Miss Ashbourne will face trial, Sir Reginald. Her confession and the circumstances, her fear of exposure, may mitigate her sentence, but the law must run its course. Mrs. Henshaw and Dr. Whitby will also answer for their actions, though their cooperation will likely lead to leniency. Poirot's eyes softened, though his posture remained erect. The law, it is just, Sir Reginald, but it cannot heal the heart. Your daughter, she acted in a moment of desperation, driven by the fear of losing all she held dear. Perhaps, in time, she will find redemption. Captain Drake looked up, his voice breaking. I should have protected her. If I'd known about her secret, I could have stopped this. Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice gentle. Captain Drake, love is not always enough to shield us from our choices. In St. Mary Mead, I have seen many young people stumble, but I have also seen them rise again. Eleanor's path is difficult, but it is not the end. Poirot nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. The little gray cells, they see the truth, but they also see the humanity. Each of you carried a secret, debts, fears, loyalties. But it was Mademoiselle Eleanor who could not bear the weight of hers. The note, the ink stain, the scuffed windowsill, these were the signs of her struggle, and they led us to her. Lady Beatrice, her voice sharp but tinged with sorrow, spoke up. And what of us, Mr. Poirot? We've lost a friend, a solicitor, and now a family member. How do we go on? Poirot's expression was thoughtful. You go on, madam, by facing the truth. The Ashbourne family, it will heal, as families do. The manor, it will stand as it has for centuries. And you, all of you, will carry the lesson of this tragedy, that secrets, they are like shadows, and the light of truth will always find them. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her thoughts drifting to her village, where the rhythms of life continued despite scandals and sorrows. She thought of a young couple in St. Mary Mead, torn apart by a hidden truth, who had found their way back through forgiveness. Witchwood Manor, she knew, would find its own path forward, though the scars would remain. As the guests began to disperse, Poirot approached Miss Marple, his eyes gleaming with respect. Madame was through the lens of human nature, and it is a lens that rarely fails. Hastings, gathering his coat, chuckled. I say, Poirot, you've met your match in Miss Marple. Perhaps we'll see you both in another case? Poirot's mustache twitched. Perhaps, mon ami. But for now, Hercule Poirot returns to London, where the little grey cells will rest until the next puzzle. Miss Marple gathered her shawl, her eyes lingering on the drawing room. And I shall return to St. Mary Mead, where the puzzles are smaller, but no less human. As Poirot and Marple stepped into the hall, the manor seemed to exhale, its secrets laid bare. The guests watched them go, their figures diminishing in the morning light, leaving behind a legacy of truth, and a reminder that even in the darkest of mysteries, the human heart would always reveal itself. Chapter 15. The Echoes of Truth. The sun hung low over the hills of St. Mary's Hollow, casting a golden glow across the grounds of Witchwood Manor as the final chapter of its recent tragedy drew to a close. The manor, with its ivy-clad walls and ancient oaks, stood as a silent witness to the unraveling of secrets that had shaken its inhabitants. Miss Jane Marple, her small suitcase packed and her knitting bag slung over her arm, stood in the entrance hall, preparing to depart for St. Mary Mead. Hercule Poirot, his own departure imminent, adjusted his hat with characteristic precision, his green eyes reflecting a quiet satisfaction. The murder of Mr. Victor Crane had been solved, Eleanor Ashbourne's confession had brought justice, and the manor's secrets had been laid bare. Yet, as always, the echoes of truth lingered, offering lessons that would resonate long after the detectives left. The guests, now diminished in number and spirit, gathered in the hall to bid farewell to Poirot and Marple. Sir Reginald Ashbourne, his face etched with grief, stood with a stoic dignity, though his eyes betrayed the pain of his daughter's fate. Captain Lionel Drake, his military bearing softened by sorrow, clutched a letter from Eleanor, his expression one of resolve to stand by her through the coming trial. Lady Beatrice Langley, her sharp tongue silenced by the weight of events, offered a curt nod while her son, Roger, hovered at her side, his nervous energy subdued. Dr. Maurice Whitby, his spectacles glinting, seemed eager to return to his quiet practice, and Mrs. Clara Henshaw, her handkerchief worn thin, managed a tearful smile. Inspector Harrow and Captain Hastings stood nearby, the former preparing to finalize his report, the latter ready to escort Poirot to the station. Poirot addressed the group.
Was born of fear, but it was the fear of losing love, of losing honor. Hercule Poirot, he understands this. For the heart, it is the most complex puzzle of all.
Miss Marple, her shawl drawn about her shoulders, nodded gently. In my village, Mr. Poirot, I have seen many such puzzles, small in scale perhaps, but no less human. A secret kept, a word unspoken, a glance that betrays. They are the threads that weave our lives, and sometimes they unravel them.
Sir Reginald stepped forward, his voice hoarse but steady.
Mr. Poirot, Miss Marple, I cannot thank you enough, though your work has brought me pain. You've given us the truth, and that is something we can build upon, even now.
Poirot inclined his head, his expression softening. The truth, Sir Reginald. It is a foundation, though it may be hard. Your daughter, she will face justice, but she is young, and the heart, it can mend. Perhaps in time she will find peace. Captain Drake, his voice low, added, I'll stand by her, whatever comes. She made a mistake, but she's not a monster. Thank you, both of you, for seeing what we couldn't.
Miss Marple's eyes softened, her thoughts drifting to St. Mary Mead, where she had seen young lives altered by a single act, yet redeemed through time and understanding.
Captain Drake, she said, your loyalty is a rare gift. In my experience, it is love, not judgment, that heals. Eleanor is fortunate to have you.
Lady Beatrice, her composure regained, spoke sharply. And what of the rest of us? Clara, Dr. Whitby, they hid things, confused the truth. Will they walk free?
Inspector Harrow cleared his throat, his mustache bristling.
Mrs. Henshaw and Dr. Whitby will face charges for tampering with evidence, Lady Beatrice, but their cooperation has been noted. The courts will decide their fate, but it's likely they'll receive leniency.
Mrs. Henshaw, her voice trembling, managed a nod.
I only wanted to protect Eleanor. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused. Dr. Whitby adjusted his spectacles, his tone subdued. As am I. I acted out of care, not malice. I hope I can make amends. Poirot's eyes gleamed with a quiet wisdom. The human heart, it is frail, but it is also resilient. You, Madame Henshaw, Dr. Whitby, you erred, but your intentions were not cruel. The law, it will judge, but life, it will forgive. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, her mind recalling a St. Mary Mead villager who had hidden a neighbor's misdeed out of loyalty, only to find forgiveness in the community's understanding.
Perhaps, mon ami. Mademoiselle Marple, she has the eye of an eagle and the heart of a sage. Hercule Poirot, he would be honored to work with her again.
Miss Marple chuckled softly, her eyes twinkling.
And I, Mr. Poirot, would welcome the chance to see your little grey cells at work once more. But for now, St. Mary Mead calls, and I suspect its quiet dramas will keep me busy.
The group moved to the entrance, where a car waited to take Poirot and Hastings to the station, and another for Miss Marple's journey home. The Manor's great doors opened, revealing the crisp autumn air, and the detectives stepped out, their figures small against the grandeur of Witchwood. The guests watched them go, their silhouettes fading into the golden light, leaving behind a manor forever changed by the truth they had uncovered. As Miss Marple settled into the car, her thoughts lingered on the case. The ink stain, the burned note, the scuffed windowsill, and the tremor in Eleanor's hands. They were the details that had solved the mystery, but it was the human heart, with its loves and fears, that had written the story. In St. Mary Mead, she knew, new stories awaited, each with its own threads to unravel, and she would be ready, as always, to listen and observe.